students fear failure. And so the question before us is, how do we help students overcome this fear? Before we answer that question, of course, we could look at some of the reasons. Well, why do they fear failure to begin with? Three that I would throw out to you today, respectfully or humbly, I would throw out to you today. One is the grades have become commoditized. Grades have now become a currency with which students move through. It's the raison d'etre of the whole reason of going to school, is to get a particular grade, because those grades are then used to, without, with only a little bit of hyperbole, totally determine the future course of their lives. At least that's what they believe. And lots of people start to buy into that narrative, which I would argue is false, but that's for another time. Another thing is what I call a learned helplessness. Lots of times students don't feel, that what they're learning is relevant to their lives, or teachers might feel that it isn't relevant to their lives, but this is what we're doing, so how we have to get through it. And so students have just become sort of conditioned to sit there and bear it. What that ends up causing, of course, is that they don't really pay a lot of attention, or they aren't, the favorite word of mine is the word intentional, and they aren't very intentional about the work and the assessments that they do. And while, even though we assume that grades are supposed to be some sort of measure or represent what students know and can do, that's not the case with what really happens. And last but not least, as far as language classes are concerned, all their other classes teach things as content. Therefore, if you get something wrong, that's a point off, generally speaking. But language isn't a content course. It's something that's innate in your head. And so language, respective of your views on the other disciplines, and with respect to those disciplines, language courses are a vastly different beast, and therefore shouldn't be assessed in the same way that other courses are. Nevertheless, students don't see a distinction between them. Therefore, they're afraid to make mistakes. So we need to redefine failure. And the way that I recommend that we're working towards redefining failure is through a couple of steps in terms of how we deal with assessment, how we look at it, and how we implement it. The first thing is we need to break away from the 100-point system. Why? Well, because there's an illusion of validity. The 100-point system is just so ingrained into our culture that nobody really questions its existence. However, there's a couple of problems with it, not to mention, notably, that it's not comparable between teachers. In other words, one teacher's view of an 82 is not the same as another teacher's view of an 82. Two, we also throw in things like pluses and minuses under the false presumption that it provides greater accuracy, but I'll talk about later why that's false. And three, 69% of the numbers mean the exact same thing: failure. The thing we're trying to avoid, or trying to redefine so that students don't feel it or fear it, but rather accept it, understand it as the way things work, and recognize that we fail at many things and we keep doing it until we don't fail anymore. A little bit more about issues with the 100-point scale and what I mean by why it's not comparable between teachers. First, we'd like to think that 1 percentage point on the 100-point scale equals one chunk of knowledge, but that's not really true. Okay? Hence the quote at the top: just because a student's grade goes up by 4 percentage points doesn't mean that they understand 4 percentage points more of information. It's intuitively pleasing if it were. It's just false and not how it actually works. Another thing is that scores on lots of tests don't measure one skill, but rather random assortment of skills. So when you see a number on the test, you don't actually know really what that number is representing. You're taking sort of the aggregate of all 5 skills. But which skill is the problem? Another issue is who scores the test. The research is incontrovertible on this, that who scores the test, right, most affects the score a student receives on any given assessment rather than their actual understanding. What do I mean by this? Here's an example. The teachers over here, if there are 3 teachers and I give them all the same test with 5 sections on it and say, hey guys, what should the weights of each of those sections be, right? And we've done this, as a matter of fact, in our own department. You'll get 3 different versions of what the weight should be. Just for quickly, the person B is like, dude, just make everything the same. There is no difference in weight. Meanwhile, teacher C is like, well, actually, this first section is the most important thing in my opinion, where these last 2 really aren't that important. And of course, teacher A. So it's all over the place. This happens a lot, okay, in schools, within departments, within divisions, even within 2 teachers teaching the same class. That's why it's really imperative that teachers get together, collaborate, make sure that they agree upon this stuff to begin with. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we agree that it's going to be 20% across the board. Then we give each teacher the same, one student's test the same way. They would still grade it differently, right? because everybody brings their own sort of preconceived notions about what A, B, C level work looks like. So, in most schools, if you ask them, what does a B look like, they can't really tell you, right? So one of the things we've done as a department is to have these conversations, and we're almost at the point we're ready to present this information, right, to the public at large. But this is what C level work looks like, this is what B level work looks like, and this is what A level work looks like. I also talked about pluses and minuses. Most people would say, well, wait a minute, the finer distinctions yield greater accuracy, which is true for direct measurement. However, most of the assessing that we do in school is not direct, but rather indirectly measured. What do I mean by that? If I ask a kid a question and they respond, right, I can only go by what they say. So they might know 10 other things, but if they don't say it, I can't assess it on it. The only conclusion I can draw is, oh, they must not know it, right? What this really ends up meaning in practical terms, right, is that the more categories you have to grade a student work, the greater the chance of you miscategorizing it. In other words, putting it in the wrong place. Think of it as going to Cheesecake Factory. You just get options paralysis. There are so many options, you end up only just getting the same thing every single time, right? So what we really need is not more categories, not 100, or A plus, B, A minus, B plus, B minus. We just need 2, not 6. Step 2. All right, we're getting off the 100-point scale. Great. Well, what are we going to do instead? Well, we're going to focus on formative assessment. The 100-point scale also generally, when we think of tests, is what we call summative tests. What's the difference? A summative test generally is a test that tests multiple skills at the same time. The formative assessments, on the other hand, only test one particular skill or concept at a time. And therefore we just do it lots of times. And the whole purpose of it, summative assessments are done to say, all right, did you learn the info? Formative assessments aren't necessarily geared to find out did you learn the info, but rather, what is it that you don't understand? All right? And then I take that information as the teacher and I use that to inform what I'm going to do in the next class or in the next activity, depending on the skill level and experience of the teacher to deal with it. Certain teachers can ask a couple of questions, see that 8 kids don't seem to know topic X, and they can shift their lesson plan instantly on the fly during class. Others, not so much, but they'll practice it and plan it the next day for the next day's class. Okay? The point of formative assessment is it's over one thing, and then the results of that inform what we do next, as opposed to this tacit assumption that everyone learns at the same time, and so if you don't get it now, well, you'll have to get it some other way. Cool. In the same vein, the third thing we're going to do then, if we're going to say no 100 points and we're going to focus on formative assessments, and formative assessments are what we do to see how well kids don't know particular info so that we can focus our teaching to make sure they do know it, then that also implies that means nobody learns at the same rate. Therefore, we have to measure student growth over time. Okay? As I say here, simply adding up points for correct answers or writing a number is an evaluation. Okay? The way we can evaluate actual learning of the students, and again, we're presuming that the purpose of coming to school is to learn information, not to earn currency via grades to move on in life. If assessments attempt to measure learning over time and try to offer opportunities for teachers to make judgments about the student's performance, then teachers need a scale that is based on a logical progression of understanding for a particular topic. Now, logical progression of understanding works, in most classes, but in language classes, it's actually different. We know from research the exact content-like things, grammar topics, for example, that we can learn and when we learn them. We know that your brain only learns certain things in a certain order, and we know no matter how many times I teach you the thing, you're not going to necessarily get it. Okay? So we have to instead recognize, let's focus on the things that we know we're going to learn. Right? And it just turns out that those tend to be the things that help us actually communicate our needs and wants. Here's an example of what that scale would look like. For me, you may remember I said in 100 points you have too many categories, or you add the minuses in the letter grades. Right? Instead of having A and B, you have, in 2 categories, you have 6 with minus and regular and plus. I actually am in favor of just the 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'll concede the point to people who want to add a 0.5 to half points on the things. What this thing actually means, number one, is that we have a greater chance of accurately placing students what their knowledge and ability to use that knowledge is. And also, more importantly for me, the goal is number 3, right? But number 2 means that kids actually know the information, but they can't do it on their own. They need some type of teacher assistance with it. And that's a key piece. They can do basic recall stuff, they can do more advanced stuff, but the teacher sort of needs to be there, almost like a security blanket, or actually sort of helping them out. Now look at this, now what's our next step? There we go. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, okay? Because that means a kid can actually get the answers correct and do the stuff, but making the distinction that they can't do it by themselves yet is an important distinction and information that's valuable for the students as well as the parents. Here's an example of what that kind of assessment might look like. These are similar. I apologize for the stretch piece, but these are similar to what we do for our 6 to 12 minute worksheets, where part 1 here is the recall, the basic facts you either know or you don't know, the quote-unquote simpler information. Sorry. Part 2 is where we actually take the info from part 1 and can we use it and apply it. And then part 3, which you'll notice, and this one is actually in English, is like, can we explain why that happens? So the presumption on this is, you know, simple, intermediate, complex, you know, understanding and thinking pieces. There's nothing wrong with not getting this part down. The analogy I always use is a car, right? You don't need to know how a car, all the inner workings of a car in order to drive. In fact, they're two completely different skills. And certainly with languages, it's an apt analogy because you don't have to know every single thing about every grammar structure in the language in order to use it. In fact, from a communicative perspective, all you need to do is be understood, not even correct. So it follows that our assessment should be that way as well. Step 4, the need for a retake policy. If we believe that students learn over time, if we believe we should measure student learning over time, if we acknowledge that not everybody learns at a consistent rate, then that also means that we have to allow for retake policies, right? Whether we give formative or summative assessments, I mean, you can give both in the real world, right? But it just means at this particular time, here's where the student is, but we need to give them opportunities to show that they've improved and grown in a particular skill or an understanding. That's what the point is. The most common sort of, you know, immediate knee-jerk response to retakes is people say, oh, so well, now I have to go and retake, every single assignment has to do a retake. Sure, but not in reality, no, right? And one of the things that we're finalizing actually for this year is what the retake policy is for levels 1, 2, and 3 Spanish and French, right? For example, an easy way to solve it without doing a whole retake, you know, set up for every single person is while you're taking the test, I just put my finger next to the number and say, look at that again. And the kid goes, oh, whoops, right? Why? Because they didn't read the instructions, because they spent 15 years in school where they've just been sort of, you know, they just go through the motions without being intentional. You point it out to them. It's clear they know it. They answered it. On the other hand, I might get the test back. I give it back to the kid and say, hey, look at number 2. What should this be? And they're like, I'm not sure. Oh, all right, well, then you got it wrong because you didn't know the information. And that's the key thing about retake policy. What we're looking for, right, as we've said before, trying to identify what a student doesn't know, is why the answer is wrong. Did the student get the answer wrong on the assessment, whatever it is, because they don't actually know the information, or is it some other reason, right? And what I mean by that, there are a myriad of reasons why a kid answers something incorrectly on a test. And it doesn't always mean because they don't know the info. It could be something as simple as they were going too fast. They weren't paying attention. The dog died and they were emotionally distraught. Who knows? As the teachers, we can't put some value judgment on that, right? We just have to simply identify, is it because you don't know or for some other reason? And if it's for some other reason and you do know, then I need to give you the opportunity to prove to me that you do. So in sum, the goal of assessing or testing is to identify what students truly comprehend. Then we need a scale that can measure learning over time rather than the traditional model of viewing language as content. You get something wrong, it's a point off. And then this is predicated on the belief that our students want to learn how to talk about their interest in another language. And to do so takes lots of time and lots of trial and error. Therefore, penalizing students for errors they commit hinders their progress. So that's how we look at and view sort of philosophically and practically the things that we do within the language class. The final thing I'll say, and I thank you all for your attention, is that obviously this is what we're working on departmentally, but in the end, I do, pun intended, have to translate back into the 100-point scale and the AAF scale because that's what people expect to see, which is fine, and I can do that. But ideally,